I think the risk manager actually plays a really critical role in being able to define the metrics by which we measure these kinds of activities. So one case in point, when we think about different horizons, there are a number of different measures of risk over those horizons, and not all measures are created equal. The typical volatility that we use, volatility over longer horizons is very hard to measure, and there are other metrics that you could use, tail probabilities, or in the cases of binary risk, probability of success or failure, that you can use in concert with the typical measures. And when you start using different metrics, you notice that behavior changes in response to those new measures. Framing is actually key in terms of making good decisions. And a number of behavioral economists have documented that when you change the frame, you can change completely the outcomes, because people's preferences are highly dependent on the context in which they're being presented. So I think we really have to be very careful in terms of managing that type of framing, and hopefully developing a consistent methodology for doing that would actually lead to more consistent investment decisions over time.
What I always try to think about is, at what level do you jeopardize, what level of risk do you jeopardize your mission, and try not to cross that line, but push your mission without jeopardizing your mission.
The example that I like to point to is the typical time horizon that it takes to develop an anti-cancer drug. Typically, we're talking about the space of anywhere from 5 to 15 years. And that's really the minimum time before you reach a proof of concept in that particular space. So if you think about making an investment in biomedicine, over the course of the first, 3 to 5 years, you can expect zero return. And so if your time horizon is limited to that short window, you're going to basically lose all your money, because you're not going to get anything back in that very, very narrow time slice. Unless you start thinking about time horizons much more directly and attuned to the particular investment opportunity, you're actually going to be in a really serious disadvantage compared to other longer-term investors. And biomedicine is just one of a number of examples where the long horizon actually matters. We are willing to take risk. We are not as willing to take uncertainty, the unknown unknowns. So from a risk management perspective, what this means is that markets will react very, very differently to things that it has never seen before, or things that cannot be quantified. A good case in point is when COVID-19 hit US shores in the middle of February. It has been many, many decades, 1918 to be precise, since the US has experienced a pandemic of the proportions that we've seen with COVID-19. And so it's not surprising that markets tanked and stayed down for about a month before they began to recover. And so it takes time for markets to digest these unknown unknowns, but eventually people figure it out. And so now we know exquisite detail about the infection rates, the mortality rate, and so on, regarding COVID-19. So what started out as uncertainty has now become risk, and actually pretty manageable risk, given that we've got vaccines and other therapeutics, and the case numbers are going down, and we can observe literally day by day, we can see the number of infections, the number of deaths, and we can track that very, very carefully.
If I could pick one thing, it's the incentives. So the question is, are short-term targets or incentives actually aligned with long-term goals? And that sounds really basic, like why wouldn't they be? But they're often not. So, really simple example, if you have an incentive to stick close to a benchmark, limit your tracking error, you're going to own companies, you may underweight them, but you're going to own companies that you don't believe in for the long run. You're still going to own them. So why are you doing that? Risk managers in particular are often asked to predict the future, as if they have a crystal ball. And I think if there's one thing we've learned in the last, year and a half, is that that's a pretty hard thing to do. So in fact, what we need to do is prepare for the unexpected more than try to predict the future. And that means this mindset of what is the dispersion of possible outcomes? What are scenarios that could happen, rather than saying, well, we're omniscient and we know what's going to happen next.
Know thyself. I think that knowing your own limits, knowing how much pain you can withstand, knowing what your pain points are, and understanding that we are all human and we will therefore react to pain in a very predictable way, I think that's the beginning of being able to build long-term wealth for your investors, because you really have to acknowledge that while we are all rational some of the time, we are almost always irrational during these extreme moments of distress, and they will occur. So once we develop that perspective and start thinking about humans as creatures of habit as well as creatures of thought, we will actually be able to develop much better policies, both for managing risk and building long-term wealth for our investors.